The recording played through her earbuds at 3 in the morning. Margaret sat alone in their Houston penthouse, her 47-year-old hands wrapped around cold coffee she hadn't touched in hours. The baby monitor she tucked into the lining of Andrew's suitcase transmitted perfectly across 800 miles. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself 15 years of marriage deserved trust. But when your husband starts mentioning his 26-year-old assistant's name more than yours, when late-night conference calls happen behind locked doors, when business trips double in frequency after his promotion to chief operating officer, paranoia becomes survival instinct. The voice coming through wasn't Andrew's. It belonged to Vanessa Chun, the ambitious Stanford graduate he'd personally hired 6 months ago. Margaret had met her once at the company holiday party. She remembered Vanessa's firm handshake, her sharp blazer, the way she laughed at Andrew's jokes with calculated enthusiasm. What Margaret heard now made her stomach turn to ice. The lawyer said if we wait until after the anniversary, she gets more in the settlement, Vanessa said, her tone clinical. 15 years is a threshold in Texas community property law. At 16 years, her claim on your stock options increases significantly. Andrew's response came calm and measured, the same voice he used when negotiating million-dollar contracts. The paperwork is already drafted. I'll tell her after I get back from this trip. She won't see it coming. Margaret never pays attention to the financial details anyway. She signed the prenup without even reading it. There was a pause, then Vanessa's laugh, soft and intimate. And after the divorce finalizes, how long before we can make it official? 6 months, Andrew said. Long enough to avoid looking calculated. The board would frown on anything that appears impulsive. But don't worry. By this time next year, you'll be sitting in that penthouse with me. She can take the house in Austin. I never liked it anyway. Welcome to Leora Folktales, where we uncover the stories that remind us karma never forgets. If you believe in justice for those who've been betrayed, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if you've ever discovered a betrayal that changed everything, share your story below. Now let's dive into what happened when Margaret stopped being the trusting wife and became something her husband never anticipated. Margaret replayed the recording 4 times before sunrise. Each word carved itself deeper into her memory. She'd spent 15 years building Andrew from an ambitious middle manager into an executive. When his company went through restructuring 8 years ago, she'd sold her small interior design business to support them through his career transition. When his mother fell ill, Margaret had been the one sitting in hospital rooms while Andrew networked at conferences. She'd hosted the dinner parties that impressed his bosses. She'd ghostwritten the speeches that earned him recognition. She'd been invisible scaffolding for his visible success. And he was planning to discard her like outdated software. The prenup he'd mentioned sat in their safe deposit box. Margaret remembered signing it on their wedding day. Too in love to care about legal protection. Too young to understand that forever was a promise people broke. She'd assumed it was standard. A formality his father's lawyer had insisted upon. She'd never reviewed it since. That changed at 9 in the morning. Margaret drove to the bank and requested access to their box. The document was 12 pages long, dense with legal terminology she'd ignored at 23. Reading it now at 38, with 15 years of marriage behind her and betrayal fresh in her ears, she saw exactly what Andrew had constructed. The prenup waived her claim to any business assets, stock options, or corporate compensation earned during the marriage. If they divorced before 20 years, she'd receive only their primary residence and a lump sum of $200,000. Everything else, including the portfolio now worth $12 million, belonged solely to Andrew. But there was something else in the box. A folder she'd never noticed before, tucked beneath old passports and birth certificates. Inside were documents dated from 6 months ago. A life insurance policy with Margaret as the beneficiary had been amended. The new beneficiary was listed as Vanessa Chun. Margaret's hands didn't shake as she photographed every page. She'd cried herself empty at 3 in the morning. Now she was thinking. Andrew returned from Chicago 3 days later with flowers and apologies about the demanding work schedule. Margaret accepted both with the same smile she perfected over 15 years. She asked about the conference. She listened to his fabricated stories about client meetings that never happened. She watched him shower away evidence of another woman's perfume, then watched him sleep peacefully beside her as if he hadn't planned her systematic destruction. She did not confront him. She did not cry. She did not reveal what she knew. Because Margaret had spent those 3 days making phone calls. The first was to her older brother, Thomas, a corporate attorney specializing in executive compensation and fiduciary duty. They met at a coffee shop 40 minutes outside Houston where no one would recognize them. Thomas reviewed the prenup, his jaw tightening as he read. "This is airtight," he said finally. "Any competent lawyer would have told you not to sign this." Margaret kept her voice steady. "Can it be challenged? On what grounds? You signed it willingly. There's no evidence of coercion or misrepresentation at the time of signing." He paused, studying her face. "But there might be another angle. Tell me about Andrew's position at Richfield Energy. Does his compensation include stock options?" He received a significant grant when he made COO. They vest over 4 years. The final batch vests next month. Thomas leaned forward. "And those options were granted during your marriage, using expertise and relationships you helped him develop?" "Every single one. I introduced him to half the board members at charity events I organized. I coached him through the presentations that earned him the promotion. Then those options might be considered community property despite the prenup, especially if we can prove your direct contribution to his professional advancement." Thomas pulled out his laptop. "But that's defensive strategy. You called me because you want something more than survival. What did you find?" Margaret played him the recording. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression darkening. When it finished, he sat back and studied his sister. "Do you know what you're holding?" he asked quietly. "Evidence of infidelity. In Texas, that affects divorce settlements. It's more than that." Thomas rewound to a specific section and played it again. "Listen to how Vanessa discusses the timing. She has detailed knowledge of the prenup terms. She's actively advising him on the divorce strategy. That makes her complicit in a scheme to defraud you of community property. And this part." He isolated another segment, where she discusses making it official and moving into the penthouse. That establishes intent. They're not just having an affair. They're planning a future using assets that partially belong to you. Margaret absorbed this. What does that mean practically? It means we can argue Andrew is dissipating marital assets to benefit his mistress. The life insurance change supports that. We can file for a temporary restraining order to freeze all accounts pending divorce proceedings. We can depose Vanessa about her knowledge of your marital finances. We can make this very public and very expensive for him. He paused. But timing is everything. We need to move before he files. Once he initiates divorce proceedings, he controls the narrative. The moment he hands you papers, we're playing defense. Margaret thought about this. "He said he'd tell me after he got back from the trip. That was 3 days ago. He's waiting for something. Probably consulting with his own attorney, making sure everything is positioned perfectly." Thomas opened a legal pad. "We need to file first. This week. Catch him completely off guard. Request full forensic accounting of all marital assets, temporary spousal support calculated on his current income, and sole possession of the Houston property. The prenup might limit your final settlement, but it doesn't prevent you from making his life hell during the process." If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." And let us know what you think Margaret should do next. Should she file immediately, or is there a smarter play? Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And don't forget to hit that like button if you're Team Margaret all the way. Margaret spent the next week becoming a stranger in her own life. She smiled at Andrew over breakfast. She asked about his day. She made dinner reservations at his favorite restaurant. And while he relaxed into the comfort of her predictable devotion, she was systematically building a case that would shatter his carefully constructed plans. She contacted the private investigator Thomas recommended, a former FBI agent named Patricia Reeves who specialized in corporate fraud and infidelity cases. Patricia was 59, gray-haired, and spoke with the weary authority of someone who'd seen every variation of human betrayal. "Your recording is good," Patricia said at their first meeting, "but recordings can be challenged in court. What we need is corroboration, paper trails, witnesses, patterns of behavior that establish this affair wasn't just physical, but financial." Over the next 10 days, Patricia worked methodically. She obtained Andrew's credit card statements through legal financial disclosure requests Margaret was entitled to as a spouse. The statements revealed hotel rooms charged to his corporate card in cities where company records showed no business meetings, restaurants too expensive and too romantic for legitimate business dinners, jewelry purchases from Tiffany and Van Cleef that Margaret had never received. Patricia also tracked Vanessa's movements. The young assistant had been less careful about covering her tracks. Her social media, while professionally curated, contained geotags that placed her in the same cities as Andrew on the same nights. A photograph of a hotel room view matched exactly the view from a suite Andrew had charged to his business account. An Instagram story showing champagne and crystal flutes was posted the same evening Andrew claimed he'd been in a late client meeting. But Patricia's most valuable discovery came from inside Richfield Energy itself. She'd cultivated a source in the company's human resources department, someone who'd been passed over for promotion when Andrew brought Vanessa in as his direct report. This source confirmed that Vanessa's salary was unusually high for her experience level. She received performance bonuses that seemed disconnected from objective metrics. And 6 weeks ago, Andrew had personally approved her transfer from the general pool into his private office, despite multiple qualified internal candidates. "He's not just having an affair," Patricia explained to Margaret and Thomas at their strategy meeting. "He's using company resources to benefit his mistress. That's a violation of his fiduciary duty to Richfield Energy. The board would be very interested to know their COO is making personnel decisions with his dick instead of his brain." Thomas reviewed Patricia's findings. "This changes our strategy. We're not just filing for divorce. We're threatening his entire career. If the board discovers he's been misusing corporate funds and authority for a personal relationship, they could terminate him for cause. He'd lose everything, including the unvested stock options." Margaret felt something cold and focused settle in her chest. What if we don't just threaten? What if we make sure they find out? Thomas and Patricia exchanged a look. "That's nuclear," Thomas said carefully. "Once you pull that trigger, there's no going back. Andrew would be destroyed professionally." "He was planning to destroy me legally and financially," Margaret said quietly, "while I was sleeping beside him. While I was hosting dinners for his colleagues, while I was believing we were building a future together. He looked me in the eyes and lied for 6 months straight. So yes, nuclear sounds appropriate." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then here's how we do it. We file for divorce on Friday morning. That gives us the element of surprise before the weekend, when he can't immediately respond. In the filing, we include allegations of infidelity with supporting evidence. We request emergency relief including asset freezes and exclusive possession of the marital home. We serve him at work during business hours where colleagues will witness it." "And the board?" Margaret asked. "I have a contact who sits on Richfield's ethics committee." He's already uncomfortable with some of Andrew's recent decisions. If I provide him with documentation of the affair and misuse of corporate resources, he'd be obligated to investigate. The board takes these matters seriously, especially in the current climate. They won't protect Andrew if the evidence is solid. Thomas added, the timing needs to be precise. We served divorce papers at 11 in the morning. By 2, the board receives the ethics complaint. By 5, Andrew's being called into emergency meetings. He won't have time to construct a defense because he'll be fighting fires on multiple fronts. Margaret looked at both of them. When can we start? The papers are already drafted, Thomas said. I just need your signature. Margaret signed them that afternoon. Her hand was steady. 3 days later, on a Friday morning in late September, everything happened exactly as planned. The process server arrived at Richfield Energy at 11 sharp. Andrew was in his office with Vanessa, reviewing quarterly projections. The server knocked, entered, and placed the divorce petition directly into Andrew's hands in front of his assistant and mistress. Margaret wasn't there to see his face, but Patricia had positioned someone in the building who reported back. Andrew had gone white. His hands shook as he read the first page. Vanessa had frozen, understanding immediately what this meant for both of them. By noon, Andrew was calling Margaret's phone repeatedly. She didn't answer. Her lawyer had instructed her not to engage in any direct communication. Every call went to voicemail. Every voicemail was saved as evidence of his deteriorating composure. At 1:45, Patricia's contact on the ethics committee received a detailed dossier. Credit card statements, hotel records, social media correlation, Vanessa's suspicious promotion and compensation history, the life insurance policy change, and the recording of Andrew and Vanessa discussing divorce strategy and timeline, demonstrating that their relationship was not just romantic, but involved the active planning of financial fraud against Andrew's spouse. By 3, Andrew was called into an emergency meeting with the general counsel and 2 board members. By 4, Vanessa was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By 6, Andrew's corporate card was suspended, and he was instructed not to communicate with Vanessa or any subordinates about the matter. The unvested stock options that were scheduled to finalize in 2 weeks were frozen pending the outcome of the ethics investigation. Margaret learned all of this from Thomas, who received updates from Patricia throughout the day. She spent that Friday evening alone in the penthouse, drinking tea and watching the sunset over Houston. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from Andrew, from his mother, from mutual friends confused by sudden social media silence. She ignored them all. The only message she answered was from her brother. "How are you holding up?" Thomas texted. "Better than I expected," Margaret replied. And it was true. She'd thought she would feel guilty. She'd anticipated doubt, second-guessing, maybe regret for destroying the man she'd once loved enough to build a life around. Instead, she felt clear-headed and purposeful. Andrew had made his choice when he started planning her disposal. She was simply refusing to cooperate with her own destruction. Andrew came home at 8 that evening. Margaret heard his key in the lock, his heavy footsteps in the foyer. She stayed in the living room waiting. When he appeared in the doorway, she barely recognized him. The confident executive who'd left that morning had been replaced by someone haggard and desperate. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed. "What the hell did you do?" His voice cracked on the question. Margaret kept her tone even. "I protected myself. The same thing you were planning to do to me, except I did it first. You don't understand what you've done. The board is talking about termination. They might void my stock options entirely. Everything I've worked for. Everything we worked for," Margaret interrupted quietly. "I was there for every late night, every pitch, every strategy session you practiced on me, every connection I introduced you to. I gave up my own career so you could build yours, And you thanked me by planning to throw me away the moment it became inconvenient to keep me. Andrew's face twisted. It wasn't like that. I heard the recording, Andrew. I heard you and Vanessa discussing exactly when to divorce me to minimize what I'd get. I heard you laugh about how I never paid attention to financial details. I heard you promise her my home. Margaret stood, facing him across the room. You made a miscalculation. You assumed I was weak because I was kind. You assumed I was stupid because I trusted you. You assumed I'd just accept whatever you decided to give me and disappear quietly. We can fix this, Andrew said, his voice turning pleading. I'll end things with Vanessa. We can go to counseling. We can work this out. Just drop the ethics complaint. Call your lawyer and tell him you want to reconcile. Please, Margaret. They're going to destroy me. No, Margaret said. You destroyed yourself. You just didn't realize it until the consequences arrived. Andrew's expression hardened. You're going to regret this. The prenup is ironclad. Even with this circus, you'll get almost nothing. You'll end up with a house and pocket change while I keep everything else. Margaret smiled, and there was no warmth in it. You haven't read Thomas's counterfiling, have you? We're arguing the stock options are community property because they were earned during our marriage using professional relationships and expertise I directly contributed to developing. We have documentation of every charity event I organized where you met board members, every dinner party where you practiced presentations, every strategic conversation we had that ended up in your pitch decks. My labor built your success, which makes those options partly mine, prenup or not. She watched him process this. But even if we lose that argument, I don't need to win in court, Andrew. I just need to make sure you lose. The ethics investigation alone will cost you the COO position. The publicity will make you toxic to other companies. You'll be the executive who betrayed his wife with his assistant and misused corporate resources to promote his mistress. Every future employer will see that when they Google you. Andrew's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You vindictive bitch. No, Margaret said calmly. I'm just someone who refuses to be discarded. You taught me that everything is negotiable. You taught me that contracts matter. You taught me that you have to protect your interests because no one else will. I was a good student. Andrew stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw the exact instant he realized he'd lost. Not just the marriage, not just the stock options, but the entire future he'd planned with Vanessa, the clean exit he'd orchestrated, the control he'd assumed he'd maintain. All of it was collapsing, and the woman he'd underestimated was the one holding the detonator. He turned and walked out. Margaret heard the front door close. Then she heard his car start in the garage. She stood alone in the living room of the penthouse and felt absolutely nothing. The emptiness wasn't sad. It was clean. The divorce took 11 months to finalize. In that time, several things happened. The ethics investigation concluded that Andrew had violated company policy regarding workplace relationships and misuse of corporate resources. He was not terminated, but he was demoted from COO to senior vice president with a significant pay cut. The unvested stock options were forfeited entirely. His reputation in Houston's business community never recovered. Vanessa Chun resigned before she could be fired and moved to California. Margaret heard through mutual acquaintances that the relationship ended within 3 months. Whatever fantasy they'd built together couldn't survive the reality of consequences. Margaret's legal team successfully argued that a portion of Andrew's existing assets constituted community property due to her direct contributions to his career advancement. The final settlement gave her the Austin house as specified in the prenup, plus $2.4 million from the stock options Andrew had already vested, plus ongoing spousal support for 5 years. It wasn't half of everything, but it was enough. Enough to restart her interior design business with proper capital. Enough to buy a small office space in downtown Austin. Enough to hire 2 associates and take on the high-end residential projects she'd always wanted to do. Enough to build something that belonged entirely to her. Thomas handled the legal proceedings with surgical precision. Patricia's investigation provided the ammunition they needed at every turn. And Margaret herself appeared at every deposition, every hearing, every negotiation with the same calm composure that had characterized her marriage. She never raised her voice. She never showed rage or grief. She simply stated facts and let the evidence speak. Andrew's lawyers tried multiple strategies. They claimed she was vindictive. They argued she'd contributed nothing tangible to his career. They portrayed her as a gold digger who'd always been after his money. None of it worked because Margaret had documentation for everything. Emails where Andrew explicitly thanked her for professional advice. Photos of her hosting the events where he made crucial connections. Testimony from colleagues who remembered her support during his career transitions. The narrative that she'd been essential scaffolding for his success was impossible to refute because it was simply true. On the day the divorce was finalized, Margaret signed the papers in Thomas's office. Andrew signed separately through his attorney. They didn't see each other. Margaret walked out of the building into warm October sunshine and felt lighter than she had in years. She drove to Austin that afternoon and spent the weekend in her house, the one Andrew had dismissed as something he never liked anyway. It was a beautiful craftsman-style home with original hardwood floors and a garden she'd spent years cultivating. She'd loved this house even when Andrew complained it was too far from Houston, too small for entertaining, too old-fashioned for his taste. Now it was entirely hers, and she could finally make it into exactly what she wanted. She stood in the backyard that evening, watching the sunset, and thought about the woman she'd been at 3 in the morning listening to that recording. That woman had been shattered. But she hadn't stayed broken. She'd taken the pieces of her betrayal and built something sharp enough to cut through every lie Andrew had constructed. The baby monitor had cost $39 on Amazon. It had seemed like paranoid overkill when she'd ordered it, and foolish desperation when she'd hidden it in his suitcase. But that small act of distrust had saved her from becoming the discarded wife Andrew had planned. It had given her the truth when everyone around her was lying. And the truth, wielded properly, had been enough. Margaret had learned that love couldn't protect you from people who decided you were expendable. But documentation could. Preparation could. The willingness to fight for yourself when no one else would, that could change everything. She'd spent 15 years being the supportive wife, the invisible partner, the woman behind the successful man. She believed that devotion was enough. That if she loved perfectly, she'd be valued. Andrew had taught her the hardest lesson she'd ever learned, that some people will take everything you offer and still calculate how to take more. But he'd also taught her something he never intended, that she was strong enough to burn down the world someone built on her back, and walk away from the ashes without looking back. If you've made it this far in Margaret's story, we want to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in standing up for yourself when the world expects you to stay quiet. Give this video a like if you think Margaret's revenge was justified, or drop a comment if you think she went too far. We love hearing different perspectives. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's being underestimated or taken for granted, share this video with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're stronger than anyone expects. From all of us at Leora Folktales, thank you for watching. Remember, your story matters, your strength matters, and karma never forgets. We'll see you in the next one.